Hi guys, as it's the 9th anniversary of Brexit, I wanted to go through some of the promises that were made by Brexiteers in the run-up to the referendum back in 2016, the likes of Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Daniel Hannan, others. They made a significant number of promises, but I want to focus on 10 of the most popular ones. Now, the first, of course, being taking back control, or in particular, taking back control of our borders. Now, this promise, like many others, and the others I'm going to go through, were broken. Net migration to the UK hit record levels after Brexit. In 2022-2023, it exceeded 600,000 per year, far above the pre-Brexit levels. Now, when the UK ended freedom of movement, it used to, before that, it relied on migration from Europe, from European countries. But because it left the European Union and freedom of movement ended, it had to rely on migration from outside. And then as people would migrate from far away, they would, in many cases, bring their families with them. So this increased the migration numbers. So while Nigel Farage, in particular, sold the idea constantly that migration was too high, it needed to come down, and the only real way to do that was to leave the European Union, that's a promise broken by the likes of Farage and, of course, the Conservatives. Now, the other promise that they made was £350 million to the NHS a week. So this was a famous one on the big red bus, vote Brexit, vote leave, and we'll send £350 million to the NHS per week instead of sending it to the European Union. But as we've seen over the last number of years, there's no connection between the money that was sent to Europe and the money that's going into the NHS. There's no real evidence to back up the claim that the money is being rediverted to the NHS. And we already know that when the Conservatives were in power, along with when Boris Johnson was there, that real funding to the NHS declined. And we saw the problems related to Brexit in other ways. The NHS not being able to access the workers it needs, and then having to rely more on the private sector. So any money that was going in, it was not being spent on public services. It was going into the pockets of private contractors. Another promise that they made was we'll have frictionless trade with the European Union. So the idea was if they need us more than we need them. So if we leave the European Union, don't worry, trade will not be affected because we sell so much stuff to them, or we buy so much stuff from Europe that Europe will give us a good deal. But the people selling this obviously didn't understand the single market, or pretended not to understand the single market. So when the UK left the single market and the customs union, obviously we saw the friction begin. And this, of course, was a problem with Northern Ireland, as I'm going to come to in a moment. But Brexit resulted in not less red tape, but more red tape, because as the UK was outside the single market, it had to complete more paperwork in order to sell goods into it. So gradually that seems to be coming down because businesses are starting to adapt to this new bureaucratic system, but also the Labour government is trying to soften some of the edges when it comes to being outside the single market. But until the UK rejoins, this is still going to be a problem. Now, another promise that was made, as I mentioned somewhat earlier, is the Irish Sea border. Remember the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Windsor Framework. Northern Ireland, before the UK left the European Union, was ignored. Jacob Rees-Mogg and others said, don't worry, we'll have an electronic border. We don't need to carry out checks. Northern Ireland will not be affected. And of course, Northern Ireland was a pivotal component in the negotiations when the UK eventually decided to leave. And of course, there are still issues with trade between GB and Northern Ireland. And if the UK diverges from EU standards, it will increase the bureaucracy and the friction between GB and Northern Ireland. The Windsor Framework brought down some of that friction, made it a little bit easier for businesses to trade, but it's still a problem. Once again, another promise broken. Another promise, number 5, from Brexiteers was Global Britain will strike trade deals with countries around the world. Now, in a sense, it has, but the idea, of course, was, well, don't worry about any lost trade we have with the European Union. We'll make it up with countries around the world. And of course, this was not true. The UK signed trade deals with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and others. But this is not recovering the lost trade. A very small percentage of trade is taking place between the UK and those countries. And of course, many of these deals were written very quickly. Farmers and other stakeholders were not consulted, and it resulted in a disaster for UK farmers, not so much for Australian and New Zealand farmers, for example. Another promise that was made was that food would be cheaper after Brexit, along with shoes. I think it was that Jacob Rees-Mogg promised. So food prices would go down because, well, reasons. Unfortunately, it did not, because the UK is outside, or Great Britain is outside the single market. So obviously, food prices have gone up because it's more expensive to import goods, it's more expensive to import food, and of course, farmers who rely on farm workers or who rely on importing materials for farming have seen the cost rise. It's more difficult to get the farm staff you need, the labourers, and it's more expensive to import certain goods for farming. So this, of course, has driven up the price of food. So not just the food to be imported, but also the food produced in the UK. And of course, exporting has been more expensive. So some businesses have either closed or have relocated their operations abroad. Another promise was that British waters will be ours again. Remember the whole thing about fishing? Well, the fishing fleets were betrayed in a sense because Brexiteers didn't understand that most of the fish caught in British waters is not consumed in Britain. It's consumed abroad. And a lot of the fish that's consumed in Britain is actually imported. So it was the worst of both worlds, leaving the single market. And of course, many fishing communities relied on the support from the European Union, which ended, and it was not supported by the British government post-Brexit. They also said that Brexit would boost the economy. Well, there's been between a 4 and 5% drop in GDP as a result of leaving the European Union. And this has impacted the most vulnerable in society. And we've yet to hear any Brexiteers come forward and explain how a 4 to 5% drop in GDP is actually beneficial to the UK economy. They also said that they would cut red tape, which of course was a plan to deregulate, but then they realized that if we deregulate too fast, we're not going to be able to sell our goods into the single market and other countries around the world. Instead, what we've seen as a result of Brexit is more red tape. The more you diverge from EU standards, and you still have to sell into the EU single market, the more bureaucracy there will be. The people, once again, who are selling Brexit didn't understand it. And finally, the icing on the cake, of course, we'll take back our sovereignty, we'll have more sovereignty, we won't have to follow EU rules. But once again, if the UK is exporting goods into the single market, it has to follow EU rules. It used to be at the table making the rules, now it's a rule taker. And this is something you hear a lot from Brexiteers. Oh, if we rejoin the single market or the customs union, we'll be a rule taker. No, the UK is a rule taker at the moment. To be a rule maker, you'd have to rejoin the European Union. So finally, I think the UK will rejoin the European Union at some stage. Unfortunately, the politicians aren't fully on board at the moment. The public, according to poll after poll, supports the idea of rejoining. Support for Brexit has completely collapsed, but the politicians are too afraid, I believe, to support the idea of rejoining. And unfortunately, until they're on board, the UK will remain out. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time for our 10th anniversary.